The Texas Revolution began with defiance at Gonzales, where 18 settlers refused to surrender their cannon and sparked a rebellion. The Army of the People proved their courage at Concepcion, their determination during the siege, and their ferocity in the brutal house-to-house fighting that captured San Antonio from General Cos. But victory bred overconfidence. Most volunteers went home, leaving the Alamo dangerously undermanned when Santa Anna arrived in February 1836 with overwhelming force. For 13 days, fewer than 200 defenders held out against thousands, buying time for Texas with their lives. On March 6th, the final assault came, and every defender died. Travis shot on the north wall, Bowie killed in his sickbed, Crockett's fate debated, but his courage undeniable. Santa Anna believed the massacre would terrify Texas into submission. But while the Alamo burned, another Texian force, 90 miles southeast, was marching toward its own catastrophic fate at Goliad. While Travis and his men died at the Alamo, another Texian force sat at Presidio La Bahia in the town of Goliad, roughly 90 miles to the southeast. This force, about 400 men strong, was commanded by Colonel James Fannin, a man whose fatal flaw was indecision at the moments when decision mattered most. Fannin was educated, having attended West Point, though he never graduated, and he understood military theory. But understanding theory and making life or death decisions under pressure are very different things. In the critical days of late February and early March 1836, Fannin would be called upon to make such decisions. He would fail, and hundreds would die because of it. Sam Houston had sent Fannin clear orders: abandon Goliad and retreat to Victoria, where the Texian forces could consolidate. The Presidio at Goliad was isolated and vulnerable. If Santa Anna's army moved south, Fannin could be trapped and destroyed. But Fannin hesitated. He had sent 2 detachments out, one under Amon King to help evacuate settlers at Refugio, another under William Ward to assist King. Both forces were now overdue. Fannin decided to wait for their return before retreating. It was a humane decision, don't abandon your men, but it was also a fatal one. While Fannin waited, General José de Urrea was systematically destroying the scattered Texian forces in South Texas. King's detachment was wiped out. Ward's men were hunted down and killed or captured. The net was tightening around Goliad, and Fannin still sat, waiting. Finally, on March 19th, Fannin made the decision to retreat. But even this decision came with hesitation and poor judgment that would doom his command. The column that left Goliad that morning was heavily encumbered. Fannin insisted on taking his artillery, 9 cannons that required oxen to pull them. These guns were powerful, but they were also slow, and speed was what the column needed most. They should have spiked the guns, rendering them useless, and marched light and fast. But Fannin, proud of his artillery, couldn't bear to leave it. The column moved through the morning at a crawl, the heavy cannons limiting their speed to that of the slowest ox. They had started late, wasting precious hours of daylight. Every delay gave Urrea more time to position his forces. Around noon, after traveling only about 6 miles, Fannin made another catastrophic decision. He halted the entire column in an open prairie near Coleto Creek to graze his oxen. The animals were tired, he reasoned. They needed rest and food. His officers protested. There was timber ahead. Coleto Creek was lined with trees that would provide cover and concealment. They were so close. Just push a little farther, and they'd have a defensible position. But Fannin overruled them. The oxen would graze here. It was the last mistake he would make as a free man. While the Texian column rested in the open prairie, Mexican cavalry scouts spotted them. General Urrea, who had been shadowing them, saw his opportunity. He had about 1,400 men, cavalry, infantry, and artillery, against Fannin's 400. And the Texians were caught in the open, miles from timber or any defensible position. Urrea's cavalry came first, hundreds of horsemen appearing on the horizon like a dark wave. They surrounded the Texian column, cutting off any hope of reaching the tree line ahead. The Texians were trapped in open prairie with tall grass but no cover. Fannin, to his credit, responded professionally once the crisis was upon him. He ordered his men to form a hollow square, a classic defensive formation where men faced outward on all four sides, presenting a wall of rifles to the enemy no matter which direction they attacked from. The 9 cannons were positioned at the corners and center of the square. Supply wagons and oxen were pulled into the middle for protection. It was textbook defensive tactics. But tactics can only do so much when you've made strategic errors that put you in an impossible situation. The Mexican cavalry charged repeatedly, trying to break the square. Each time, disciplined Texian rifle fire drove them back. The Kentucky long rifles, accurate at long range, picked off riders before they could close to saber distance. Bodies of horses and men began to litter the prairie around the square. The Texians were holding, but they were also dying. The Mexican artillery opened fire, lobbing cannonballs into the packed formation. Unlike in the open field battles at Concepcion, the Texians had no terrain to shield them. Every cannonball that hit the square tore through multiple men. The screams of the wounded filled the air, and there was no water. As the afternoon wore on and the Texas sun beat down, thirst became torture. The Texians had been marching all morning. Now they were fighting, sweating, loading and firing their rifles in heat and stress. The black powder smoke made their throats raw. Their mouths felt like they were filled with cotton. Coleto Creek, with its promise of water, was visible less than a mile away. They could see the tree line, see where they should have been if Fannin had pushed just a little farther. But Mexican forces now blocked the way. The creek might as well have been in another country. Men began to cry out for water, wounded men especially, their cries growing more desperate as the hours passed. The sounds of their suffering demoralized those still able to fight. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but how do you ignore the pleas of your dying comrades? The fighting continued until darkness finally brought a merciful pause. The Mexican forces pulled back slightly, their cavalry forming a perimeter around the square to ensure no one escaped. The night of March 19th to 20th was cold and miserable. A damp mist settled over the prairie, chilling the men who had thrown away their coats during the heat of battle. The temperature dropped, and the Texians shivered in the darkness, teeth chattering, with no fires allowed that might give the enemy targets. The wounded moaned and begged for water that didn't exist. Men tried to comfort them, but what comfort was there? Medical supplies were minimal. Bandages were torn from shirts. Men pressed cloth against wounds to stop bleeding, knowing it wasn't enough. Some of the wounded went mad from thirst and pain, their cries echoing across the prairie. Others fell silent, dying quietly in the darkness. The living counted the hours until dawn, each man knowing what daylight would bring. During the night, Urrea's reinforcements arrived. Fresh troops and, more ominously, more artillery. The Mexicans were setting up their cannons in positions that would allow them to rake the Texian square from multiple angles. The Texians could hear the sounds of preparation, the rumble of gun carriages, the shouted orders, the rhythmic work of men digging artillery positions. They knew what it meant. Come dawn, the Mexican artillery would have the range and the position to destroy them systematically. Dawn came gray and cold. As visibility improved, the Texians could see their situation clearly. Mexican artillery now surrounded them on 3 sides. Fresh infantry had arrived. Urrea had at least 1,000 men in position, rested and supplied, against Fannin's 300-some survivors, exhausted and desperate for water. The Mexican artillery opened fire with devastating effect. Grape shot, clusters of metal balls that spread like a shotgun blast, tore into the square. Cannonballs punched through the ranks. Men fell in groups rather than individually. The oxen and horses in the center of the square screamed as shrapnel tore into them. The smell of blood and gunpowder was overwhelming. Fannin gathered his officers for a council of war. The situation was hopeless. They could fight to the death, but what would that achieve? Their families would never know what happened to them. The revolution would lose 400 men who might live to fight another day if they could negotiate surrender. The decision was made. Fannin ordered a white flag raised. What happened next remains controversial. The Texians insisted they surrendered with specific terms. They would be treated as prisoners of war and paroled to the United States. Some survivors, like Andrew Boyle, later swore that these terms were clearly stated and agreed upon. But the document Fannin actually signed said they surrendered at discretion, unconditionally, subject to the mercy of the Mexican government. General Urrea himself noted in his diary that he promised to intercede for clemency, but he couldn't guarantee anything. Santa Anna's orders were clear: execute all prisoners taken under arms against the government. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding across language barriers. Perhaps Fannin, desperate and defeated, heard what he wanted to hear. Perhaps Urrea genuinely hoped to save the prisoners, but knew he had no authority to promise it. Whatever the truth, the Texians laid down their arms, believing they would live. They were formed into columns and marched back to Presidio La Bahia in Goliad. The wounded, including Fannin himself, who had been shot in the thigh during the battle, were loaded into wagons for the journey. As they entered Goliad, many of the Texians felt relief. They had survived. They would be prisoners for a while, but then they would go home. The war was over for them. They were tragically wrong. For 8 days, the prisoners were held at Presidio La Bahia. They were crowded into the chapel and other buildings, given minimal food and water, but treated reasonably well. Some began to hope that perhaps they really would be paroled. Meanwhile, courier riders were galloping south with messages for Santa Anna and north with his replies. The general's orders were brutally clear: execute the prisoners. They were pirates and criminals, not legitimate prisoners of war. They would be shown the same mercy they would have received at the Alamo: none. Colonel José Nicolás de la Portilla, the Mexican commander at Goliad, received these orders with horror. He was a professional soldier, not a butcher. He sent messages back asking for clarification, hoping for a reprieve. None came. Santa Anna's orders were repeated, this time with added emphasis: execute them immediately. Portilla found himself in an impossible position: disobey Santa Anna and face a firing squad himself, or obey orders that violated every military honor he believed in. He chose obedience, but the decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sunday, March 27th, dawned warm and clear, a beautiful spring morning that seemed to mock what was about to happen. It was Palm Sunday, a day of religious significance, which made what was coming even more grotesque. The prisoners were told they were being moved to different locations. Some were told they would march to Matamoros to be paroled. Others were told they were going to work details. The wounded who couldn't walk were told they would be treated. The prisoners, desperate to believe, mostly accepted these explanations. They formed into 3 columns under Mexican guard and marched out of the Presidio. The 3 columns were marched in different directions along the roads leading out of Goliad. Each group was accompanied by Mexican soldiers, more soldiers than seemed necessary for a simple march. About a mile from the Presidio, at nearly the same moment, officers in all 3 columns gave a command. The guards, who had been marching alongside the prisoners, suddenly turned, leveled their muskets, and fired point blank into the unarmed Texians. The volleys tore through the prisoners at ranges measured in feet. Men fell in rows. The screams were immediate and terrible. Some prisoners, in shock, didn't understand what was happening. Others tried to run. The Mexican cavalry had been waiting for this moment. Lancers spurred their horses after the fleeing men, running them down in the prairie grass. The long lances pierced backs, chests, necks. It was systematic slaughter, not battle. One survivor, Dillard Cooper, later described seeing his friend Robert Fenner shot through the chest during the initial volley. As Fenner fell, mortally wounded, he shouted to the other prisoners, "Die like men." It was a cry of defiance in the face of murder, an attempt to give meaning to meaningless death. Some men took up the cry. Others simply tried to survive. Cooper himself survived by playing dead, lying among the corpses until the soldiers had left, then crawling into the brush and making his way east. John C. Duvall escaped by running into thick brush near the San Antonio River and hiding for days, surviving on roots and muddy water. A few dozen men escaped in similar ways, playing dead, hiding in the brush, outrunning the Lancers through luck and desperation. But over 340 men died that Palm Sunday morning. In the midst of this horror, there were moments of mercy. Francita Alaves, the young wife of a Mexican officer, had been living at the Presidio during the prisoners' captivity. She had brought the prisoners food and water, showing them kindness when she didn't have to. On the morning of the massacre, Alaves hid several prisoners in her quarters. When soldiers came looking for them, she claimed they were her servants, essential workers who couldn't be spared. Through a combination of charm, argument, and sheer determination, she saved about 20 men from execution. Later, Texians would call her the Angel of Goliad, one of the few sources of light in that dark day. Her courage stood in stark contrast to the cowardice of following orders that were fundamentally evil. Colonel James Fannin, too wounded to march with the columns, was executed separately inside the fort. According to accounts, he faced his death with dignity. He gave his watch to the officer commanding the firing squad, asking it be returned to his family. He asked not to be shot in the face and requested a Christian burial. Both requests were ignored. He was shot in the face at close range, his body stripped and thrown on the pile with the others. His watch was kept as a trophy. The bodies of the massacred were left where they fell for weeks, slowly decomposing in the Texas heat, until local Tejanos eventually buried them in mass graves. The sight and smell served as Santa Anna's intended message. This is what happens to rebels. Santa Anna believed the twin massacres at the Alamo and Goliad would terrify the Texian settlers into submission or flight. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Rage swept through Texas like wildfire. Men who had been reluctant to fight now grabbed their rifles with fury. The massacres transformed the conflict from a political dispute into a war of survival. Santa Anna had declared by his actions that surrender meant death, that no quarter would be given, that this was a war of extermination. Very well, the Texians would give the same in return. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad, became the battle cry that would unite every Texian force. It was shouted in camps, carved into rifle stocks, whispered as prayers, and howled as war cries. Sam Houston's army, retreating east before Santa Anna's advance, now had the moral clarity it needed. This wasn't about constitutions or politics anymore. This was about survival. This was about revenge. The massacres had created not terror, but determination. Santa Anna had united his enemies more effectively than any Texian leader could have. He had given them martyrs, and martyrs are more powerful than living soldiers ever could be. In 6 weeks, at a muddy battlefield near a river called San Jacinto, Santa Anna would learn exactly how powerful martyrs could be. The twin massacres at the Alamo and Goliad had claimed over 500 Texian lives in less than 3 weeks. Santa Anna believed his brutal campaign of terror would break the rebellion, that the slaughter would send settlers fleeing east to Louisiana in panic. He was right about the panic. The runaway scrape saw thousands fleeing before his advancing army. But he was catastrophically wrong about the terror breaking their will. Instead of submission, the massacres ignited a fury unlike anything Santa Anna could have imagined. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad became more than a battle cry. It became a promise of vengeance. And Sam Houston, retreating eastward with his ragtag army, was about to keep that promise. If you've come this far in the story, you can't stop now. Like and subscribe to see how Sam Houston turns retreat into victory, how remember the Alamo, remember Goliad transforms from grief into a weapon, and how 18 minutes at San Jacinto will avenge months of tragedy. The finale is coming. Until next time, stay curious